Guthrie, Oklahoma, on March the 28th, 1972. I am Mrs. Gordon Ferguson, sitting in the home of Mrs. Banks Hughes Furrow. Mrs. Furrow's father made the run into Oklahoma, and today we're going to discuss her memories, her experiences, and her mother. What was your mother's name?
Ella Lapel Pop.
Tell us about your earliest memories here in Guthrie.
Well, my earliest memories in Guthrie are rather comical. This was where all the Indians came for their allotment because we were territorial, Oklahoma territorial capital. And as a little child, we had been to a church meeting. And when we came home, there were 4 Indians wrapped up in the blanket asleep on my porch. And it nearly frightened me to death. That really is my earliest memory.
Well, what about tell me about the people that came in here. Were you aware of the people coming in their covered wagons?
No, I was not born then. I have only heard tales from my parents and from my husband's parents.
Describe Guthrie to me in your very earliest memories when you were a little girl here.
Well, it was the proverbial small town, no paved streets. We had the huge gullies on each side of the street. And when it rained, the best thing we could do was to run out and jump in the gully and get all muddy and have our parents furious about it. It was a great cotton market. And I have pictures showing the cotton wagons sitting down on Oklahoma Avenue, which of course was not paid, for the auction of their cotton. And that's, really that's the first thing I know about, in the industry in Guthrie.
Were there Indians here? Were there Indians here when you came?
Oh, yes.
And they lived here in Guthrie?
No, they lived out up near Ponca City, Call City, and Newkirk, but they came in here for their allotment.
Then later on, at the time of the Constitutional Convention in Guthrie, tell us what you and your family were doing and what you saw then.
Well, again, I was still a small child, and I had an uncle from Edmonds who was a representative. And he used to take me down for me just to watch. It looked like a circus. But the first ice cream cone was made on waffle irons, and they would make them hot, roll them up, and put our ice cream in it, and that's really why I went to the Constitutional Convention.
Oh, I never heard that before. That's wonderful. You mentioned earlier to me about seeing some sort of an ink-throwing incident at the convention.
Yes, that is in history, in many history books. I think it was Bill Murray and Haskell, as I remember. I may be wrong there, but there was a great hullabaloo in there in the convention, and the first thing I knew, they were throwing inkwells at each other, and my uncle hurried me out.
You didn't get to see all of that. Banks, recently going through Guthrie, it occurred to me that this is perhaps the museum of the state, certainly as far as cities are concerned. This wonderful city that time in a way seems to have passed by so far as some of these buildings are concerned. And my thought was, how wonderful if this had happened. It's like some of the cities in Europe that time passed by and then eventually they become the cities of the greatest interest. Do you ever think of Guthrie as maybe the museum city of Oklahoma?
Yes, I do. And in fact, our first library here was the Carnegie Library, which was secured for us by a Mr. R.W. Ramsey, who was from Scotland and had been a boyhood friend of Mr. Carnegie. And through the association, Mr. Carnegie put the library here. My mother happened to be on the library board, the first one. So, of course, I'm interested in it. Right now, the city has taken it over as a historical site for Guthrie, and through the generosity of a Mr. Piper from Orlando, he has made it a museum and has added a section to the old building to house old implements and early-day farm machinery that we use. In the meantime, Guthrie has built a new, modern library, and through the efforts of a great many citizens, this museum was established, and it is under, I guess you would call it, the control of the Oklahoma City Museum, because Mr. Church comes up here to see what's going on. It will be opened, I think, to the general public this coming July 4th. I might add that it was on the steps of this Carnegie Library, now the museum, where Governor Haskell was inaugurated. I, being a small girl, was asked to serve punch at the reception in the old hotel, which then was the Royal Hotel. That was previous to the building of our I-Own Hotel by Mr. W.H. Coyle. It was named I-Own for his daughter, I-Own Coyle.
She still lives in Oklahoma City, doesn't she?
Yes,
I-Own
she
Coyle.
still lives in Oklahoma City.
And
John Coyle, the son.
Yes, he still lives there.
In Oklahoma City. He married one of the daughters of G.A. Nichols.
Yes. Mm. Was there across the street from the I-Own Hotel some old thermal baths at one time?
Yes, that came later. Guthrie has medicinal properties in some water in Mineral Park. And it was the idea that we would make a health spa of the place, and they built a bathhouse which had a huge, to me it was huge at the time, swimming pool, and that is where I learned to swim.
I can remember that as a little girl, when we would come to Guthrie and spend the night at the I-Own Hotel, and I think my father and mother would take the bath there, and that was when the railroad station was such a bustling place. Of course, we jumped a good many years from the Constitutional Convention, but perhaps not so many. When
our railroad station had the Harvey House, the best one on the Santa Fe line, and it was always Sunday night dinner at the Harvey House.
I remember it very well as a little girl coming here to change trains, and here would be all the people to a trial. There was a great bustle of people, and that's hard to believe now, isn't it?
We all went down to see the 4 o'clock train go through. Also lived here, and Mr. Cottingham, who was the attorney for the Santa Fe, lived right beside our home. At one time, we had a Fort Smith and Western train here that went east. And through Mr. Bledsoe, he allowed his little daughter Adelaide and me to ride in the engine of the Fort Smith and Western train. We rode as far as north of town out to where the first little Furrow and Company greenhouse was. We got off, our parents met us, and asked us how we liked the ride, and we both said we'd rather ride back where the porters are.
That was a big thrill for a couple of little girls, wasn't it? I don't think and no little girl can do that today.
No,
see, there's no fun in a diesel engine, is there? No thrill. Don't you remember also what a thrill it was when that charging iron monster roared into a station?
Oh, the noise was deafening.
And all the tooting and the steam coming out of this engine and those great wheels turning, those were thrilling days. I remember as a little girl, the Opera House is still here. What was the name of it, and who built it, and about what was that year, Bang?
Frankly, I've lived so long I can't remember the year. The name of the Opera House in the beginning was the Brooks Opera House, and it was adjacent to the old Royal Hotel where Governor Haskell lived during his reign as governor until he went to Oklahoma City.
Well, the Opera House is gone, but is the Royal Hotel
No,
still
it
here
is
building?
all gone. It is a parking lot, a city parking lot.
Mm-hmm. Well, tell me about some of the plays that used to come through here, and also how did the people dress? Women are always interested in that.
My first recollection of the Opera House, while I didn't go, my mother and father were going to see Man on the Box. They looked to me just like a king and a queen. My mother had on, of course, a long dress, very full skirt, umpire lines. It was in white, trimmed in blue velvet, and she wore a long velvet cape. My father, of course, was in his cutaway suit, high silk hat, and a gold-headed cane. In those days, the mode of transportation, if you didn't ride in your own buggy, was to have a cab, a hansom cab, they called it. I shall never forget when that cab drew up to the front door, and my mother and father walked out to go to the performance. When they came home, they were in ecstasy. They thought it was a wonderful play. Most of the women wore plumes in their hair. My mother had had her plume dyed blue to go with her white and blue dress and blue cape. That is my first memory of the Brooks Opera House.
Tell us about the Opera House. What did that look like inside then?
It was Victorian. Later, when they started having shows for children, I was allowed to go, and I was always impressed with the red plush seats and the beautiful, beautiful crystal lamp chandeliers, all prisms. Many of those have been taken out and put in homes as far as Baton Rouge, Louisiana. At present, where the Royal Hotel and the Brooks Opera House was located is a city parking lot. What a pity.
Well, that is a pity and a great loss to Oklahoma. Did operas also come through here? Did Madame Schumann-Heink came?
Madame Schumann-Heink was here. I did not get to hear her. Children were not allowed to go to places those days. But I heard her in later life, in fact, was a protege of Madame Schumann-Heink.
Was she one of your singing teachers?
No. It happened, I sang in the First Methodist Church in Kansas City in 1915. I sang the aria, I Know That My Redeemer Liveth, from Handel's
The Messiah?
The Messiah.
Mm-hmm.
I did not realize that Madame Schumann-Heink was in the audience. But later, the president of our college came to me and said that Madame Schumann-Heink was having a tea out at the old Redpath Horner Institute and would like for me to attend. I did, and she asked me if I would consider going into Grand Opera. She explained what a hard life it was, but she was willing to back me and train me. And I said, no, thank you.
Banks, now tell me, have you ever regretted saying no thank you to Madame Schumann-Heink?
No, because I sang lullabies to two lovely children. I was soloist in the temple choir, the Masonic temple choir, for 18 years, and I still sing in a church choir.
Well, I can see that you have no regrets or frustrations about that. While we're on the subject of theater in Guthrie, and this was one of the places where this is a mecca. People go for many, many miles. I know that I would come with my family over here to hear Sir Harry Lauder. I remember hearing him sing. And didn't Caruso also come here?
I do not remember that, but while we're speaking of theater, we had south of town, south of the Mineral Wells Park, what we called Electric Park, and we were on the circuit of Chautauqua, and we had many, many high-class Chautauqua entertainments here.
Yes, those were great things in those days. And also, while we're on the subject of theater, Didn't Tom Mix at one time live in Guthrie?
Tom Mix lived here. I do not know from where he came. My memory of him is teaching formal education in the basement of the Carnegie Library. My husband was a very good friend of his, and he told me that he at one time was a bartender here, also delivered ice. When he came back for one of Guthrie's famous 89er celebrations, he was a guest in our home and bought his beautiful white horse from a Mr. Ed Pritchett who lives in Mulhall.
Is Mr. Pritchett still alive?
Mr. Pritchett is still living.
And also the famous movie star Lon Chaney. Didn't he come from around here?
I don't know what you would call him, but he managed all the scenery in the old opera house.
But he didn't stay here. I guess he left and went on to his Hollywood ventures.
He left early. I have no memory of ever seeing the man. I just know that they lived here in Guthrie.
And you told me that Will Rogers was a good friend of your husband's. Tell us more about that.
Well, it was, of course, all early day and before I was born and knew anything about it. But he did work for a while, Will Rogers, at 101 Ranch, and used to come to Guthrie, and my husband was very, very fond of him and knew him very well.
Didn't you say that the first time you saw him, you and your husband were on your honeymoon in Chicago?
That was in 1918, and we went to see the Ziegfeld Follies, not knowing that Will Rogers was appearing. When we found it out, my husband wrote a note, gave it to the usher, and before the performance was over, we were invited backstage to talk to Mr. Rogers.
Well, that's very interesting, this man that became such a great hero in this state. Were you as charmed by his personality as everyone else seems to have been?
I was simply awed.
Thanks. Let's go back a little bit in time again. We're doing a lot of skipping around. Did you know, or your family know, or as a little child, do you remember any of the early territorial governors who lived here in Guthrie?
The first one that I have heard my father and mother speak of was a Governor Jenkins, and he lived where the parking lot for the First Methodist Church is now. However, I did know Governor Barnes personally because I played with his grandchildren.
Where did Governor Barnes live? Is that site still here?
That home is still living, and I believe Mr. and Mrs. McClurg have recently moved from Oklahoma City and bought the former Governor Barnes home and have restored it, even to leaving the old plate glass windows as it was when I knew it.
Well, Oklahoma can be grateful for that. At least there's one thing restored here and as it was at one time. Then, of course, we know that later the capital was removed to Oklahoma City. Now, those must have been exciting days. What do you remember of that?
I remember that it was a terrible jolt, and the rumor around was that we were sold down the creek to the Rock Island and Frisco railroads wanted to come in to Oklahoma City. The powers that be, I will not name them, sold out to them. That is the rumor. Anyhow, Guthrie made a valiant fight to retain it. We sent out numerous circulars all over the state trying to vote the capital back here. And they had meetings in the Carnegie Library, and all children, I included, would go down and lick the stamp to put on the envelopes that went out to all these people. We lost, but Oklahoma City well deserved it.
Do you ever feel that there is any bitterness left in Guthrie at all because of this quick midnight transaction that took place?
It was very, very long before that bitterness faded. In fact, that generation are dead and gone. The younger people just don't care.
Tell me a little bit more about the mood of the people at the time, Banks.
They were furious. The merchants thought that we would be ruined. They had many, many meetings, marches down the street, saying, "Bury Oklahoma City." But to no avail.
But there was meetings held, marches, rallies.
Oh, yes. In fact, my husband was offered a 5-acre tract where Winans Addition now is, if he would move his greenhouses to Oklahoma City. They wanted all the industry out of Guthrie that they could get. And because of the intense, hard feeling of Mr. Furrow's parents, it was never done.
Well, that is very interesting, and I've never heard that before, and I don't imagine that many people have.
No, I certainly have, because I don't remember it.
No. But you do have now, after all these years, don't you have a wholesale outlet in Oklahoma City?
We have greenhouses on South Walker and 59th Street, wholesale house at 28, 30, 32, 34 Broadway Circle, in spite of our large plant, which is still at Guthrie.
Well, yes, I know the Furrow Floral Company and Guthrie have been synonymous in people's minds for a great many years. Banks, in these early days in Guthrie, there must have been a social life existing among the government officials' wives and among the social leaders here in Guthrie. Tell me about some of the parties the ladies would have.
Well, they just had beautiful parties, and I, once in a while, was asked to assist in taking the ladies' wraps or any little job that a child would do. I distinctly remember as a child when Mrs. F.O. Lutz gave a luncheon, and I think it was more or less the Capitol ladies and some of the Guthrie ladies. It was to have been an orchid luncheon, or purple, whichever, and everything was violet, pansy. The hostess wore an orchid dress, and everyone that went to this party had something orchid or lavender, mostly their dresses, and beautiful, beautiful flowered hats. I shall never forget Miss Lutz's daughter Adelaide and I spent most of the afternoon trying on the ladies' hats. In a few weeks, my mother, Mrs. G.A. Hughes, had a Lily of the Valley luncheon, which, of course, she imported the Lily of the Valley from Kansas City. It seems that most of Guthrie's social life, clothing and floral arrangements in those years, even to the individual ice cream packs, were shipped from Bird Fair in Kansas City. My mother had a very unusual light fixture at the entrance of the hall, and I can remember, because I was little, they held me up, and I draped the lilies of the valley around that. We had them everywhere. It was not a white dress affair, but I tell you, the ladies all wore beautiful, beautiful clothes. One dress that I remember distinctly was of Mrs. Judge Burford.
Did all the ladies wear lilies of the valley pinned to their dresses or on their hats or something?
No, it was not advertised, as you might say, as a lilies of the valley party. My mother, from girlhood, was very fond of lily of the valley, so that's the flower she used.
Well, this is very interesting to us today because, as you know, no one could or would go to that much trouble today to have a party. But I have heard Mrs. Lutz, Edith Lutz, talk about her party when everything was lavender, with the stair rail wrapped with greenery and violets tucked in that, and the linen on the table was of a violet color, and the napkins had violets embroidered in the corners, and it is such detail that it amuses us today, and at the same time we admire people going through that much trouble.
Well, in those days, everyone had help. Now, you can't do it.
That is very true.
Wait a minute.
It sounds to me like Guthrie had quite a social life in those days, Ben.
Well, with the capital being here, naturally they did. Right offhand, I can think of, I do not know the initials, but the names were Menefee, a Judge and Mrs. Turner, a Mr. and Mrs. West, Judge and Miss Hayes, and Judge and Miss Furman, and a Bird McGuire,
Well, that, and of course there were the government circles besides this, the officials that were here in town.
Yes, they all, I think there was a man here by the name of Rural Haskell that went down to Oklahoma City and was still in the government after he went down. I really don't remember all of them. I was just too young.
Was that the Haskell that was the first governor? Wasn't there Haskell?
Yes, Haskell. And, of course, his daughter married here in Guthrie. And, again, I was asked to serve punch at the Ion Hotel after the wedding reception. She married our leader, our Guthrie Daily leader, editor.
Back, we talk about the social life in Guthrie, but for the moment I'm going back to before there could possibly be any social life. What do you remember your mother and father saying about their absolute first arrival in this new country?
Well, I remember that my father had just graduated from Vanderbilt University. They thought he had tuberculosis. They sent him to Deming, New Mexico, where he lined up with a bunch of Mormons and was on a chain gang for surveying for Deming, New Mexico. He heard of Oklahoma being opened. He made the run, settled in Guthrie. Mr. Furrow's father and mother were from Troy, Ohio. They made the run and settled on a farm out west of Edmond. My husband was 12 years old, and I have heard him tell about driving 50 head of cattle through, and it took a month to get here. They lived in a half-sod, half-board house until they could build a home.
Well, that was one of the, I'm glad you mentioned that. That was one of the things I wanted to ask you. These people arrive in a completely new country. There's no hotels, there's no rooming houses, there's no boarding houses. They have to have shelter, and they have to have food. And do you remember your parents ever mentioning how their parents handled that problem?
I have a picture showing Tent City, as it was called, where everyone lived in a tent until they could find or build a dwelling.
They would sort of live in communities, tent communities then, I guess.
Yes, and all water had to be carried from Cottonwood Creek.
Well, life was hard then.
Well, I didn't live then.
Yes, they did the pioneer work that made it possible for us to live here under entirely different conditions today. Well, now, in Guthrie, after it becomes established, is it true, as I have often heard, that there were open saloons here, that many ne'er-do-wells came from all over the United States, and in these open saloons, murder was a common thing?
I remember very well of seeing a saloon, never, of course, being in it, but Carrie Nation visited our city, and with her hatchet, there were no more saloons. In fact, my husband liked to tell the joke where he and another young man were standing on the street smoking a cigar, and she came and knocked them out of their mouths.
She was one of the early women to live, wasn't she? She was really one that lived.
The night that the saloons were closed, it was open house, first there, first served. The saloon keepers just let all their liquor be given away, and there was many a drunk lying on the streets the next morning.
Guthrie must have been an interesting sight, as were cities every place the morning after the declaration that liquor was now forbidden.